So I'd like to now introduce you to our panelists. So we have here Hanne, Kristin. Hanne is a clinical psychologist of 20 years and works with Alternative to Violence, that's ATV Norway, working clinically with adult perpetrators of violence and their partners and children, as well as working with adolescents who use aggression and violence both at home and in public. Hanne, you are very welcome. Thank you. Kris Decraemer of Interactie Academie in Antwerp, Belgium, an institute for systemic theory and practice. Kris works as a therapist, family mediator, trainer, and supervisor around domestic violence. Kris and her colleagues work collaboratively to develop methods to support victims of domestic abuse. Kris, you're very welcome. And then we have Dr. Declan Coogan of the National University Ireland, Galway. So Declan is a lecturer in social work and is a research fellow with the UNESCO Child and Family Research Centre. Declan's research focused on child-to-parent violence and non-violent resistance, and he facilitates a training program in this area. His book on this subject was published in 2018. So you're all very welcome. So let us take a look now at the guiding questions. So question number one to Hanne, first of all, what is your perspective on understanding this phenomenon?
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the question. I was actually, when I was trying to figure out what to answer, I was thinking, is this a phenomenon? What's a phenomenon? Is this something I don't know? Do I have a different client base? But I thought maybe I should say I'm not sure if it is a phenomenon. But there are children and families struggling with all kinds of different things. And like it's been said before today and yesterday, I think we need to think of this in an individual case by case manner. And where I work, we're in concern with understanding, why is this particular child or adolescent struggling to express themselves in a way and that is more healthy. And how can we understand this child's feelings, motivations, needs? How can we understand the family? Why is this going on? So we have to help both the child and the parents so they can start on a better journey, like we heard about recently. So I'm not sure if there's like one way to understand it. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Hanne. Okay, so what I'm hearing you saying there is you're not sure about the term phenomenon, right? And that we have to look at it again, as we mentioned earlier, these are individuals. It's not one size fits all, it's case by case, and the importance of understanding the child's needs. Okay, so the same question to you then, Kris. What is your perspective on understanding this phenomenon?
I will try. I first will refer to the slide I saw that was shown, the ecological slide. Mm-hmm. So that's for me also, that connects always, because we were in a systemic area and we want to connect individuals with all these broad influences within the family, but also between family and all the outside world, networks, etc. So I like especially these broad perspectives. And the last question was about working with families with adult children. And I think in our work, especially the last years, we tried to develop methods to work with, especially with parents. You could say that if the problem is not solved when the children are 18, you can have parents with children of 20, 25, 30, 35, 40 who stick in the same pattern. Families are sticking in the same patterns. And it's especially there that we could see, that's a bit our way of understanding, trying to understand that we always think there is a kind of parallel in the patterns that are co-created within the family. they always have a kind of link with the same kind of patterns that are co-created between the family and the outside world. For example, we see that in these families, there is a lot of invariability. For example, the contextual invariability. The child, they live in the house, and for years, the son maybe is living in the upper room, the family lives downstairs. And the contextual variability sticks. They never go outside anymore as a family. They don't go to a movie. They don't play cards. They don't eat together. So there is a lot of family possibilities to be a family, to be child-parent interaction that has really stuck, becoming an impasse. And it's a bit the same also in the outside world. That is the title of your workshop, I discovered. Please help to fix my child. Then immediately you have also a stuck answer from the outside world. If it would be my child, I would know what to do. I put it outside the house. It's 25 years, doesn't have to be there anymore. Get out of it, get rid of it. So in the outside world, you get also this kind of very invariable narratives, conversations, dialogues about what to do, how to look, how to behave. And that's also a bit the parents' the situation inside. So it means that this broad perspective can also help not only to focus on the dyadic exchanges between parent and child, but also keep in mind that what is stuck inside the family is also connected with the whole interchanges between the family and the outside world. For example, when a child is 18 years, there is still a law in Belgium that you have to go to school. And if you don't go to school, there will be control or people will come to the house. But once your child is 20, 25, 30, and it's not coming anymore in the outside world, it does not have connections anymore with services, with school, with education, with work, nobody will interfere. Yes.
Okay, so looking at there, the necessity to look at the broad perspective, to focus on the inside with the family home, but outside in the outside world. You mentioned if it's not resolved by the age of 18, that children grow into adults and they take these same patterns of abuse with them that they grew up with. So that is the age. If it's not changed by then, we're into difficulties. Yeah. Okay, thank you. And you mentioned the importance of the interaction with the family as well in the home. Okay, thank you very much for that. Declan, please, the same question. What is your perspective on understanding this phenomenon?
Okay, thank you. Can I begin first of all by saying how happy I am to be here? I've already.
Happy to have you.
Well, thank you very much. Hopefully I can say something that's of interest. But already from today and yesterday, I have learned so much. I want to remind us of something we heard yesterday in the panel discussion down here yesterday afternoon, when one of the panelists suggested that if we ask people to do domestic violence work, we need to remember that those people may also be living with domestic violence as well in their families or within their wider network. And so I think the similar perspective applies to us gathered here today. We are talking, of course, about the complex problem of child-to-parent violence and abuse. Let's remember it may also be within this room. We may also have colleagues who either themselves live with this at home or people who they know close to them live with this in their home. I think that's really keeps me focused, keeps me respectful. So I'd like us to remember that. I think also I'd like to say that this is a very interesting discussion so far today on domestic violence. We had some great input earlier on from Justine about her work with respect to UK and the young persons program there. But I would like to remind us that child-to-parent violence and abuse occurs in families where there is no domestic abuse. There are, of course, some links. There are, of course, we see it in some families where there's domestic abuse. We also see child-to-parent violence and abuse. But in terms of my work, my direct clinical practice work and my research, it's also occurring in families who are not involved with services for any other reason except child-to-parent violence and abuse. So we need to keep that in mind. And so this is where my own perspective comes, how I understand this problem. Myself and colleagues in Ireland over the last, well, since 2007, we've realized that there is, as we've heard so far today, also from Justine, that there is no simple explanation or no simple definition of this problem. So we need to be open to all kinds of ways of understanding it, and then, of course, all kinds of ways of resolving it. So one idea we have is that child-to-parent violence and abuse is caused by habitual patterns of behavior. We all have habits. I have good habits. I have bad habits. I'm guessing people in this room have good habits and also perhaps some bad habits. I'm not going to ask you about your bad habits. But in some families, the habits around conflict resolution are unhealthy and are negative and lead to escalation and violence. And this is where we see in some families child-to-parent violence and abuse. So I think a useful way of beginning to address child-to-parent violence and abuse is to see it in this way, because it's non-pathologizing. We don't blame the parents. We don't look for parental deficits and skills. We talk about the fact that we all have habits. Let's look at the habits in your family. Let's look at conflict resolution, and let's see what we can do differently. So out of that emerges what we might talk about later on in our discussions about a particular approach to resolving NVR. But we start with resolving child-to-parent violence and abuse. But we start with an understanding it's to do with conflict in some families and to do with patterns of behavior and to do with habits.
Okay. So that's a very interesting perspective. Child, adolescent, parent violence and abuse does not necessarily always appear in homes where there is domestic violence. That sometimes it appears in homes where there hasn't been any domestic violence. The child hasn't been subjected to it. So that's an interesting perspective on that. Yes, unhealthy, abusive, violent conflict, the habits and how they develop. And the resolution, I think, is what you're saying, really lies in developing conflict resolution skills. Is that fair to say?
That's
developing those.
That's part of the resolution.
Part of the resolution. Okay, thank you for that. Right, question number 2 then. What works in changing attitudes and behaviors? And could you give a case example, please? So back to you then for this, Hanne.
My biggest case example will be in my workshop. Oh, sorry.
We all go.
But where I work, we are quite mindful of finding out the motivations of the parents and the children, and finding out what do they see as the problem. Do they agree on what's going on in the family? And we have to talk to them separately to listen to how the children experience what's going on, how they experience the parents, how their life is going. All this socioeconomic model is fantastic for that, and we need to learn what's the issue to learn what to change basically, and when we work with adolescents and families, we both try to understand but also try to teach new skills for problem solving, mentalization, empathy, communication. We try to be quite hands-on and use a lot of what's it called? Is it called flip over in England? Or like write on a flip chart. Yes, that's the word. Thank you. And be quite concrete, because if we talk about this in general, nobody's understanding what we spoke about 10 minutes from now. So, and we try to find a common ground and a common way forward and try to make some agreements. Let's try this out, problem solve, troubleshoot, and say, if this doesn't work out, let's troubleshoot next time. What went wrong? How can we change it? And be quite hands-on. And we have found sometimes that some parents also do need some more parenting skills to try to understand their kids better. I find that many parents don't understand the developmental level of the adolescents and the children, and they have high expectations for the children, or they have maybe don't understand the social media context, how the way of the world is today, and we have to kind of teach what is normal, what's natural, how are other kids behaving in families without violence, and also we find that some of the parents we meet, they do have their own problems with trauma, with emotion regulation difficulties, with aggression, and sometimes we manage to recruit them to have their own treatment at our facility. So yeah, Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, so from working in cases in your workshop, you find that motivation is important, teaching problem skills, communication, troubleshooting. Also an issue in this, the expectation of parents. What does parents expect from their children and the pressures in turn on the children within this? Yeah, thank you for that. Kris, the same question then. What works in changing attitudes and behaviors, and could you give a case example?
I will maybe highlight a bit because it's very interesting what you say. And I think that are ingredients that I recognize. I think that because we start with families where we cannot reach the children, impossible to get the children out of the house. They do not come to, they don't go in the outside world. So they are not motivated, 0% to come into to a caretaker or therapist. So it means that we start with a family, with the parents, and parents who are very vulnerable, very, they don't have any glue anymore of mattering for their child. So it means that we mostly start with the concept of mattering, because we make a difference that in intimate violence between parents, it's about partner identity, about love, love relations. But if we go to parent-child interactions, it's about, can I be a good caretaker for my child? And can I be seen as a good, worthy child in the eyes of my parents? And we use a bit that concept of mattering for each other, because we think that during the big impasses and all these interactions that get stuck to very, very difficult experiences, that people don't have a glimpse anymore, I matter in a good way for my child, or that the child doesn't have experiences anymore, I can matter for my parents in a good manner. So it means that our first step is always to reinforce the parent in what does he see as good parenting for that particular child, because the parents has a lot of ideas about the worries about the child, about the difficulties about the child. The parents, it's not for nothing that the parents say, I cannot throw him out. It's not only because they don't dare, it's also because of good parenting, because they see some needs, they want to care about for their children. So it means that, for example, we use a lot of imagery that parents can reconnect again with good experiences of parenting, because they lost it completely. And it's for them very risky to change these patterns of impasse, this invariability. The very slow difference you ask is a very risky difference for them. And it can really also bring a very big crisis into the family. So you need support also, yeah.
Thank you, Kris, thank you for that. So, yeah, can't reach the children, they're stuck in the home, they're in the home. Do you mean, you know, on PlayStations, or is this what you mean by being stuck in the home? Just
sometimes for 10 years, they did not go out anymore of that room.
So they just don't.
So the patterns are so not changeable and invariability that you have to start there.
Okay, no outside influences. All right, so the concern of the parents within that, not knowing the dynamics as a parent, how to be a good parent, getting stuck in that and reinforcing the idea of what is a good parent? How do we make a definition of that? And the reconnection, I hear that very strongly with you, to reconnect with the child. Okay, thank you for that, Kris. Declan, then, same question to you, please.
Okay, so thank you. I think in similar to the ideas we've heard both from Hanne and from Kris, what's important is the idea that parents have about themselves as parents. And by the time they come to work with us, they often feel that I am a bad parent, I am to blame, it's all my fault, I am hopeless, I am ashamed. And also the idea they have in themselves of their child as being an out of control child, a crazy child, a mentally unwell child, or in some cases, just like his father child. And so mentalization, the idea that parents have of each other and of their child is so important. But where we start, certainly with our work here in Ireland, is where we start with ending the shame and the stigma and the isolation of parents. If somebody gave me a magic wand and said, where would you start? I would start with a public health campaign about conflict in families. And I would say that if you have these patterns of behavior in your family, it's not your fault. We all fall into bad habits. Let's address those habits. But you asked us to think about a case example. And so I will share with you what I would call a composite case example. So it's not exactly a case as I describe it, because I want to protect confidentiality, but the person who I have in mind is a real person, actually two people, two parents, and their child is a real person. But I'm going to change some details so that nobody here, and importantly, nobody online, will be able to identify who we're talking about. So this refers to a couple that I worked with late last year, around November, December, we finished our work. And this was over Zoom, because at the time in Ireland, we still had very tight restrictions when we began this work. And as it happened at the time, these people were living geographically quite far away from Galway. So Zoom worked really well. I had been using Zoom in my other work. So when I offered some work over Zoom, people were happy to come by Zoom. Can you all hear me? Okay, I see one person back here doing this. So, okay, so I'll try and speak even louder. So these people had been suggested that they contact me by a psychiatrist who was working with them because their daughter was no longer going to school. We heard about school refusal earlier. She had not been in school for several months. She had been abusive at home towards both mom and dad, also abusive, I mean physically abusive towards mom and dad, and also towards siblings as well. Interestingly, not physically abusive towards siblings, but aggressive and threatening towards siblings. And also this young person had 2 mental health illness diagnoses as well. So the parents, as many parents do now, thankfully, they will search for us online and critique our approaches and say yes or no. So at the first meeting online, I talked a little bit about the model that we use, the approach we would take, and I asked, did they think this would be useful? And they said, well, we've tried everything else, so we'll give it a shot. So, but the first thing that we began with was to say that this is not your fault. And whatever mental health your child's diagnosis is, it is not uncontrollable. Because this is one of the myths that we seem to have, certainly in Ireland, I can't talk about other countries, is that if a young person has a mental health diagnosis, they get like a white card. You can do whatever you like because you can't help it. I will use parliamentary language and say that's not true. Because this seems to give parents a sense of hopelessness, because my child has a diagnosis, what can we do? And it seems to give the child an excuse. I can't help myself. The tablets aren't working. So we disregard that kind of excuse. So we don't disregard the diagnosis. Let me be very clear. We don't say this is rubbish. We say, regardless of the diagnosis, let's look at what we can do to help change things. And then we would go through, over a number of sessions, the different elements of NVR, starting with parental self-care, parents learning new skills, parents learning de-escalation skills, parents doing more of what they already do that sometimes work. The model we use is very solution-focused as well as being systemic. So you talk about, you're here because you feel as parents you're not coping, you feel that you're not able to manage your child. But think back to the last time you got through to your child, or the last time you managed to avoid an escalation. What did you do? So those kinds of things. And then we encourage the parents to do more of these things, to practice more of these things. And then when we have our follow-up sessions, we go to we begin with a solution-focused review of the period between the last session and this session. And then we look at what's been different since the last session, but also what were the struggles and what were the successes. And then we go through week by week the different themes that are in the framework that we use. And by the end of November, to cut a long story short, parents said that this has been really helpful, really supportive. Our child is back in school. Now, I'm not blaming this all on NVR, let me be very clear. There was also psychiatry involved in the parents' home place. There was also, we have, like you have in your country, a school attendance officer was also involved. So all of this network, and also, of course, I meant to say, Parents also involved grandparents and aunts and uncles in a targeted way. And this led to outcomes where parents were able to report they were no longer afraid of their child. There was no longer assault at home. Their daughter was much happier. Family life was much happier. And the child was back in school almost full time. So this is just one example.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Declan. Okay, a lot in that. Parents blaming themselves, having ideas about the child. He's just like his father, getting past that, practicing new solutions involving wider family. Through the work that you've done, the results sound like they've been really positive. So a child who refused point blank to go to school, then happily, I take it, happy to go to school. So not just
perhaps not initially, but yeah,
okay,
but yes.
Yeah, in time through practice change. Yeah.
And just also to add to that, that as we heard earlier from Justine, this particular young person has real struggles in school with friendship, with performance academically in school. So it was about involving the school and addressing those issues as well.
Yeah, and that was very interesting. That connects to Justine's talk earlier about the fact that children, even in the pandemic, not going to school in some cases caused less anxiety and less aggression. So there's a lot in that, I think. All right, thank you very much for that. All right, so the last question here then, is there any learning from this work that could inform the work with young adults who act abusively? So if I could ask you to be kind of snappy with this, relatively.
Well, I think there's a lot of learning being described already, but from my context, where I initially started working with adults who use violence in intimate partner relationships, and 3 years ago we started working with adolescents. I think the biggest difference is that we have to have the context in mind, and we are more concerned with when we work with adults, we're very concerned with saying who's responsible. The adult is always responsible for their actions, regardless of if they didn't mean it or they couldn't help themselves or whatever. It's a very strict baseline at work, and everybody who comes to my office, which is called Alternative to Violence, everybody expects us to talk about violence, which makes it much easier to talk about violence if you can get them in the room. But with the adolescents, we are more, we find that we have to be much more careful about what kind of situations or actions we address and where we start. And the most important thing is to make the kids and the parents feel comfortable and safe and respected, and that we are understanding and mindful that this is difficult and nobody wants to hurt their family and nobody wants to use this behavior, and we have to be even more sensitive to not increase shame in order to have them in the room and have someone to work with. So I think that's what I've learned the most about since we changed from both adults until younger people. Yeah.
Thank you, Hanne. Thank you for that. The same question to you then, please, Kris.
I think the broad theme of sensibilization, that it's a bit more known in society, that it can happen as a family, that without guilt, without wanting it, that you arrive in that kind of very difficult impasses and situations. And it's like you said, when we started this work and we asked our clients, team colleagues, etc., who knows somewhere a family who has that, we got a lot of stories. And then we are so surprised that there is no shared talking about it, about the difficulties. So I think it's very good that we work also with group of parents, that people can share with each other these difficulties, and also that we work the whole time in reconnecting the parents with the outside world, with networking, but also the adults that we see, that once they get with all these blocked connections with the outside world, that you really also must look how can we bring them in again in the whole system.
So Kris, just to clarify that, so you say working with groups of parents and giving that an opportunity to share their experiences. Does that work then like a support group as such?
It's, I know that these experiences, I look a little bit to Pascal, because in the family justice centers in Belgium, they work a lot with, there the counselors can go to the house, and sometimes they can meet these adults also, but they also have a lot of experience, good experience in working with mostly mother groups. And so it helps the mothers very, very much to share their stories, to help each other, and also to support each other. I said, changing this kind of patterns asks a lot of courage, a lot of courage, because people have been in all these experiences of terror and fear. And so they need also to meet people that maybe are one step before in experimenting, in daring to change a little bit the way of behaving. And that can be these models can be very inspiring for them. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Kris. All right, and the same to you then, Declan. Is there any learning from this work that could inform the work with young adults who act abusively?
I think so, and I really like the idea of daring to change. What a wonderful name for an intervention, daring to change. So I think I want to echo something that we've heard yesterday in our afternoon speaker, Carolina, when she's reminded us that if we don't ask, for example, about social media use, we won't hear about it. I would say it's the same thing about child-to-parent violence and abuse, particularly if you're not working in a domestic violence service. And many of us nationally are not. Many people here are, and this is great. But if you're not working in a service that is domestic violence specialist service, I would say we should always ask about experiences of safety within the home. Always, 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 always ask. And then what I would also say, what's very useful is to go back to what you were both saying earlier as well, is that if you think about working with survivors of domestic abuse or intimate partner violence, we would never say to mostly women that, oh, well, he had a traumatic childhood, he can't help himself. Or, oh, well, he has ADHD, he really can't help himself. We would never say that. And that is right. We should have a similar approach when working with child-to-parent violence and abuse. So we take what we call a human rights abuse and a children's rights, a human rights approach and a children's rights approach to child-to-parent violence and abuse. There is no excuse for abuse ever. We might understand it differently depending on history and depending on trauma and depending on experiences. We might therefore also seek other interventions or other therapies as well as what we're doing. But we need to be very clear with children and with parents, there is no excuse for abuse. And this is in legislation around the world. This is the Human Rights Declaration. Everybody has the right to be free of inhumane and torturous treatment. Parents talk to us about being tortured. Parents talk to us about living in inhumane circumstances. That is an infringement of the Human Rights Declaration. And also child-to-parent violence and abuse infringes the rights of children because it robs children of family life to which they're entitled to. So we need to be very clear in taking a children's rights and a human rights approach to child-to-parent violence and abuse. I could say more, but you said be brief, so I'll say no more.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Yeah, quite strong words there, tortured. Parents describe it sometimes as feeling tortured in their own homes by their own children, quite strong. Okay, so just to sum up some of those points, so from Hanne, the difference is looking at who's responsible. So we take this approach with adults, looking at who's responsible, but we need to be a little bit more sensitive when we're working with adolescents. We need to be mindful that it's so much more difficult for them to maybe find the words or the language to express how they feel. Kris talked to us about working with groups of parents, sharing, and yes, I like that, daring to change. You know, it implies having the courage, because it does take courage. It does take a lot of courage. And Declan's point there, seeking to understand, I think, but not excuse, really, is the message there. You know, things like he can't help himself. So taking a human rights approach, because after all, there is never an excuse for abuse. Thank you very much to all our panelists for that. So we would now like to open our question and answer session. Unless there's anything that you would like to clarify or comment on before we go there. Oh, you're happy, okay. Right, we have a question here. Yep, this man here.
Oh, sorry. Yes, thanks a lot for all the information this morning on a new topic for me. I haven't thought about that a lot. I missed one point this morning, or one perspective. I heard not a lot about a gender perspective. I heard about children, adults, conflicts between them, how to solve it, but I heard not much about boys and girls and men and women. And I don't know what that means. Is that in this work, perhaps it's not so important? So the category age is more important than the category gender? Or what is the role of gender in this work?
So the role of gender as opposed to age. This can be open to the audience as well, by the way. So anyone who has experience or background in this, feel free to comment.
Thank you for that question. That's a really good question, and I don't particularly have the answer, but I can have some qualified guesses maybe. Because where I work, people are referred to us, and there are way more parents and schools referring boys than girls. We do have girls as well, but mostly boys. And I know from the field of adult violence that maybe the boys hit harder or more, or they have bigger struggles, or they struggle more with gaming, or they don't even struggle with the gaming, but the parents struggle with gaming. And I think maybe parents are more mindful or worried about their sons and daughters, or maybe the difficulties of the boys have a different expression than difficulties in girls. Maybe the girls go to mental health services and the boys are referred to us. I don't know, but I'm sure the more we talk about, both genders using violence, the more we get women in as well, historically speaking, at my office. And also women are more help seeking than men. So we're a limited resource. So we're a bit careful also. How do we market ourselves? Because we do want to help those we can help the best and who help the most families, or we have to find the severity level that's fits what we're supposed to do. And if we market it, I guess girl and female violence, and we described it better, which we should, I'm sure, that we would be flooded with too much work to do or something. So I think there's so many reasons why we're talking about men and boys and not girls and women. But I'm sure, and we know that women use the same amount of violence as men, but some of the violence is less harmful. So there's many different ways we could work around it, or be more concerned with gender, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you for that, Hanne.
Yeah, I think it's an important question, but I think it is a question. We really don't know. There is some really good work done in Spain by Ibabe and her colleagues, and Calvet and her colleagues.
Could you say that again?
Oh yeah, Calvet and her colleagues in Spain, and also Ibabe and her colleagues in Spain also. They have found a gender perspective. Interestingly, if you go to arrest samples or prison samples, you said this yourself earlier, you tend to see more boys using physical abuse towards parents than girls. Well, I think it's for the reason you suggested earlier. But then if you go to community samples in Spain, it's almost parallel. You have boys and girls using the same amount of physical violence towards mums or dads. So, but we don't know. It's very early in the research. So I think there is a gender question, but I don't think we have any gender answers, because it's to do with who seeks help, who is more worried. As we heard earlier, men don't often report their sons to police because they don't want to be a victim in their homes, as seen so by the police. So it's a question.
Okay, thank you for that. Yes, we have a question back here with Colin.
Thanks, Roisin, and thank you to the panel. I think that you've done a really good job at answering what are at times challenging questions. Just in relation to that second question there, you've given 3 very concrete and clear examples of what you see as best practice or examples of behavioral change in action. And, you know, what comes to mind and what I find quite frustrating and challenging at times is that often you see, you know, new initiatives or new programs emerge, which, you know, would nearly seem like in a weekend we can solve these issues, right? So my question is that given you've given us really good examples of your work in making change happen, but I want to know what is the extent or what is the duration of these programs? Because if we're talking about challenging entrenched norms and behaviors which are conducive to or condoning of violence, we really need to know the extent of that engagement. How many weeks, how many months, what does it look like? What does it feel like? So thanks for that.
Yeah. And also if that would make a difference, I guess, the extent, the duration of the programs, does this have an impact on its success?
Okay.
Well, you're being too polite. We need to get moving here.
It's about respect.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much for the question. It's an important one. And this, of course, is where I'm going to show my bias because I use a particular kind of model that's been developed in Israel by Hanne and his colleagues. And there are some outcome studies that are very promising. But it's a new area of research. But in terms of structure, I'll get to the point. NVR model, it's a short-term systemic intervention. It's designed to take place over between 10 to 15 sessions. Now, as you know, this could be over not 10 to 15 weeks, it could be over 10 to 15 months, depends on the interval between sessions. So that's approximately it. It may vary depending on the level of intervention required, on parents' request. It also depends on whether if the parents need, for example, assistance with, say, addiction, can they also access that at the same time? So in NVR, our approach is not an either or. Either you get, let's go with addiction, either you get your addiction sorted, then you come to NVR. It's, if you're telling me you need help with your addiction, great, let's get you support for that. Meanwhile, let's continue with NVR. So it's not, I don't want to give a false example that NVR is the fix all. Where other supports are needed for the parents or for the child, please get them as well. But as I say, NVR is structured around 12 to 15 weeks, sessions rather, maybe more, together with other things.
Clarify NVR for people who mightn't be familiar with that term.
Thank you so much. Yes, sorry, NVR is a model that's named non-violent resistance. And it was developed first for working with families in Israel, in Tel Aviv, by Hanne and his colleagues there, and has spread further since then. It also has I'll be very quick, also has a very long history in political activism. Think of Martin Luther King, think of Mahatma Gandhi, and now I don't think of Daniel O'Connell. So but that's just some ideas.
I just, I think it's inderdaad a very new area of working. And we use also a combination with NVR. So that gives a little ground on our practice. And I think because it's the only practice evidenced survey, we can we work by the effects in the framework that it will never be 100% solution, that we can stop and set boundaries on the aggression, but that the families and the parents and the children, grown-up children, will have maybe a lifetime of looking for how to live together, how to make your living in a complex world, and with not always good instruments, good ingredients. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. Right, we have time for a couple of more questions. We've one over here.
Oh, I hate these things. Can you hear me?
Yes.
It's just probably on behalf of
Sorry,
my
actually,
colleagues.
could you bring it a little,
Oh, sorry.
closer? Yeah,
It's more an observation and just maybe a point at the end of it. I suppose from our perspective, what we would work, we would see quite a lot where the child, and I mean 12, 13, 14, seems to take on a role by dint of the fact that he or she, mainly he, has gone out on the street and he becomes an earner. It's obviously the drug trade, but it's also wider than that at the moment in terms of it's not just the young kid who's selling, but it's also people who are holding cash and a whole industry around that. And we would see them take on a different role in the family. They become the earner. There's collusion sometimes with the parent along that lines, what's spoken, what's not spoken about. And I suppose what I would see when I see child, adolescent to parent violence can be that direct violence within the house, that everything's up the ante, but also that communal violence in what it's bringing to your door. Examples where people are having to leave their homes because of the son's activity out there in the community, where once he was popular, now he's not popular type of thing, and the chaos that comes. So it's that level of violence, and it's that probably, I suppose where I was getting to as well, is early interventions in that area would lead to an endemic kind of secrecy around that, because it's on the borders of criminality, and it is, collusion and resistance. And I suppose that's something we all walk into in this work. And I suppose that's the word I'm coming up to in terms of working with resistance. Your thoughts on that on all kinds of levels. I'd be interested. It's called Jonach. It's a probation project where probation would refer into us in Tala. It's based in Tala. We'd cover most of South Dublin, so we'd work across that areas, and then there's issues all around those areas, really. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thank you. There is so much we could say about resistance. I just see a former student here. I'm not going to use the phrase I've used in class. But anyway, about resistance, we would take a very solution-focused approach to resistance, in that when we see resistance, we look at what we are doing as a practitioner and what we are doing as a service, and change what we're doing. Because resistance is often spoken about in health and social care as if it's in the person, it's in the child, or it's in the parent. And what happens then, of course, is we get locked in patterns of chase and resistance, which doesn't work. We know this from our work with families. So then what we do is we think about, how do we engage the family? And so because I know we're up against time, what I would say is we would use a solution-focused approach to resistance. We would change what we're doing. But also, in terms of my work, I'd work very closely with services, to use your example, that are expertise in working with addiction or drugs or dealing in the area. Because I don't have that expertise. I can bring NVR. But for example, we work very closely in the west of Ireland with the Western Regional Drug and Alcohol Task Force in their work. So we have recently run a parents group using NVR, which they tell me has been very, very useful and very, very helpful for parents. So, but I could talk to you maybe afterwards about resistance, because I love talking about it. Yeah,
listen, during lunch, as we mentioned, these are opportunities for networking. Use them. The opportunity to sit face to face with someone and make these connections. It's we're very fortunate that we can do that over these couple of days. Okay, I think we just about maybe have time for if there's one more comment or question briefly before we wrap this up. Yeah, up here.
Hi. So thank you for your very helpful contributions, and just reflecting back onto Justine's excellent presentation. I was just wondering what the panel thinks about the process of consequences and the use of consequences as a mechanism for change in this area.
If you mean consequences about the aggressive behavior, yes, because then I rely a bit on what you said, that we stand, of course, for a non-violent living together of people, and that's also an issue we talk about with the parents. What is acceptable in society, and how is society looking about how parent-child interactions can be, and how living in families can be. And sometimes it needs also dialogues with the parents. Where will you put the line? Where will you put a line? Because it's also a conversation, because in the outside world, they only have very shameful conversations about bad parenting, not putting a line. But of course, it needs another context of speaking with parents. That's what is their idea of good parenting? How do they look to the societal boundaries, the justicial boundaries, and where will they put as a parent the no-go point, and how can they stand for it? And what support do they need to be able to behave like that, to have a posture like that, to talk like that, and to start also with their child new conversations. Yeah.
I think as there are so many different levels of difficulties, it's so difficult to answer the question about consequences, really. But when we work, we try not so much to focus on consequences, but to make it more interesting, to cooperate or have better communication and to thrive, because nobody really wants. Sometimes I talk about the consequence of what happens, if you don't do this or that, and then the mom is angry, and then the school's angry, and that's the kind of consequence. And how can we avoid this? Not making it a consequence, but trying to how can you work or be in a more efficient manner so that you can do what you want to do? What do you like? How do you want to spend your time? How do you want to interact with your family or your friends? So I think that's much more interesting and much more fun and so much more rewarding, because when people or kids have problem behavior, it's quite easy to give them good experiences and make them motivated to change or do things in a different manner, and also to motivate parents to choose their battles more wisely. Or to not throw around consequences that are impossible to enforce or whatever. So I think when I talk about consequences, it's more about how it doesn't help us in finding a common path. But of course, when there's dealing with drugs and severe violence and everything, the answer would be different. But with the clients I meet, it's just it increases resistance, and we don't want that. We want cooperation. Yeah.
Thank you. I would agree with what you've said, and also consequences is a hot topic. In social work in Ireland, many of us, which is my background, many of us are trained in, say, parenting programs like Parents Plus or the Incredible Years or the WWP parenting program, or perhaps indeed all three. And as we heard yesterday, though, these kinds of programs are useful for particular kinds of interventions, but not for child-to-parent violence and abuse. They don't target these kinds of behaviors. So I believe in these models which rely on consequences or use consequences, and they work for those kinds of presentations for which they were designed. But similar to what you're saying for NVR, we do not talk about consequences. We don't set up, because it sets up a dynamic of conflict. So, for example, if you're working with, say, a lone parent where they're finding it hard to insist on house rules, and you tell them, well, okay, what's going to be the consequences? They're going to lead to more conflict, not less. So, but we find other ways. It's like natural consequences or inbuilt consequences of different behavior, and about setting clear goals. And so when you set positive, clear goals for the young person, for the parents, that necessarily excludes more and more negative behavior. But consequences, it's one of the topics that I love talking about. Yeah.
Okay, so positive, clear goals for parent and child adolescent. We have a question coming in online. Yes, okay, do you want to call that out? Run, Michael, run. Okay.
We have a question from an online
So could you speak up? Just hold the mic a bit closer.
We have a question from an online participant who asks, do you use any specific risk assessment during your work with youth that are violent towards parents?
Any specific
Risk assessment.
Okay. So it's not just me. Risk assessment. Do you use any specific risk assessment? No. Okay.
We ask about safety.
Well, my answer is we don't. We are trying to, where I work, to find out how can we work with child-parent violence, and we don't know the answer. And I'm learning a lot today and yesterday and maybe tomorrow about what can we do and how should we do it and what can we try out. But I'm in the fortunate position of making it up as I go along with solid education and experience, of course. So I'm eager to learn, but I have very little experience with risk assessment, and many times people call us with adult perpetrators as well, and we don't really do that. So I don't really have a good answer, but I think it's important that you guys know that sometimes we don't do it, or we don't know, or we don't have the knowledge yet, so that other people who don't know what to do also can feel that's also okay or normal. And if someone really has any good risk assessment forms or experiences, I'm eager to learn about that. Yeah.
Maybe, sorry to interrupt, during networking sessions, talk to one another, questions that were raised here. I'm hearing a few things over and over again, and it's communication, support, motivation. I think it's something that Justine brought in this morning as well, which was quite interesting. It was the families, once they sat down and spoke to one another and communicated and said what they felt, again, from the heart, this is what made a difference. So that there really is something in that.
May I just go back to the risk assessment? I said, no, we don't, but that was very briefly. But of course, we do ask about risk. I don't want to give the impression we don't care about risk. Of course we do. But if the question is about, do we use a particular actuarial tool or a particular questionnaire? No, we just use good practice questions around mapping risk that many of us will be trained in and that we would do.
Good practice questions that the professionals have been trained in. Okay, we're going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you so much to the panelists for that very insightful talk.